Hi, welcome to our last episode of Worldviews in Church History. Like you, I thought we would never get here. Anyway, let's start with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for the privilege of doing this series, and I pray that today's final episode, and really all the episodes, would help us to have perspective for what's facing us now. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. The Worldviews in Church History, week 30. Now this is going to sound like a really antithetical statement, or almost a schizoid one, but it isn't. It's called Epistemological Breakdown in the Suicide of Civilization, Hope for the Future, and Our Mission in the Final Analysis. Yes, I know how that sounds. But you can write me anyway if you want. Ideas have consequences, and if mutually exclusive, tribal-like worldviews are each right, then, well, none of them are. Okay, there's no way you can have it both ways. Cause and effect happens in the upstairs realm of meaning, ethics, and values, not just in the lower mechanical realm. And those of you who've seen the series up until now, you know what I mean by that. It is logically possible for everyone to be wrong. It is not logically possible for everyone to be right. That is simply, you can't have that in the real world. A civilization that believes this only Caesar rules in the real world kind of subjective truth, which is what ancient Rome did, well, that civilization is schizoid. It is not living in the real world. In fact, nowadays, it is living in the real world even less than it was during Roman times. At least in pagan Roman times, it could be said that they never really encountered anything different before. Well, we have a civilization that has encountered it, and for various reasons, some seemingly valid, but really most of them not, it has rejected it in favor of this sort of subjective kind of living by one's feelings all the time. To willingly choose this on a civilization scale is for that civilization to effectively commit spiritual and intellectual suicide. Because reality always catches up. In fact, if we were to have a nice, concise title for this last episode, it would be Reality Always Catches Up. Feel free to use the meme. I'm not a meme guy, but as memes go, that's not a bad one. And of course, I mean objective reality, not the stuff we spin in our own heads. We are at the place where Christians must make the case that the God of the Bible is the God of reality, all reality. If we cannot coherently make that case, then preaching the gospel is moot. It's a useless exercise. Because if the God of the Bible isn't the God of the real world, then the gospel it contains doesn't really do anything in the real world, because it's not a product of a real world concern. But sin, I think we've seen that sin is probably the most real world concern that there is, because we're certainly smothered in this stuff. It is clear that our nation and society have chosen the worldview of Freud over that of C.S. Lewis. This is a book by Dr. Armand Nicoli Jr., and we don't have it in the bookstore yet, but I'm going to make a priority for it, because Dr. Nicoli's book became a course at UNM and other colleges, but at UNM it was taught by one of the last Christian professors that I'm aware of I mean kind of conservative-like Christian professors that I'm aware of, that had tenure there, and he was teaching that as late as 2008. Now this conflict of worldviews, which we've been really looking carefully and closely at, is the same that drives the culture wars of today. Now, C.S. Lewis was, most of you probably know, was one of the great Christian minds of the 20th century. He was a forerunner of the renewal that was later embraced by the Jesus movement and other forces of restoration that we've seen in the 20th century, and we would hope to see again in the 21st. Yet it now appears, to me anyway, having been a Christian for over 40 years, it appears that really all our generation could do, and I'm speaking mostly of my generation, was to delay, not reverse the darkness. And I think realistically, we all kind of knew that all along. But just in case one of you out there doesn't, there you go. And C.S. Lewis's life, he wrote the Oxford History of English Literature. He did a lot of, he was a philologist who did a lot of work in language, in the history of language. And of course he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, everybody's heard of that. And a play was made out of him in a movie called Shadowlands. And he was the second most recognizable voice on the BBC during World War II, with the exception of Winston Churchill. Because C.S. Lewis used to come on and he would console people, he would challenge them, and he would give them a kind of a guiding light during the times of the London Blitz and the terrible times of World War II. Now, the bookstore carries Lewis's books, including Mere Christianity, The Abolition of Man, the Screwtape Letters, and the Space Trilogy. When I was a boy, I could go into a bookstore, and in every science fiction section in the bookstore, you would see C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. It was as well known in the 1960s as the Chronicles of Narnia were. Of course, the Chronicles of Narnia are now very well known. Hardly anybody has heard of the Space Trilogy. It's a very interesting set of books. Anyway, we've got them all in one volume there. With Freud now securely in the cultural driver's seat, our society has accepted the idea that sexual desire is the ultimate determinant of human behavior. Remember determinism? Well, in a Freudian worldview, sexual desire is the deterministic factor in human behavior. Not only that, he is also well known for saying religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. Really, Sigmund? Aren't we overdoing it just a little bit? I think so. Because when the science of Freud was shown to be more opinion than science, a society based on scientism did not keep up with the science. And this is the problem with scientism and what is often called today a scientocracy, where everybody's just trying to follow the science. Well, there are times when you need to follow the science, certainly, in certain areas where science can speak authoritatively. But scientific knowledge changes as more data comes in. Now, that's not a weakness of science. That science should be that way. As more data comes in, you have to factor it in. And it does, it changes things. But it's also why government, requires a more stable foundation for law than science. Because if you're just following science, you're going to be following back and forth, because science tends to go on that whole pendulum thing, like almost everything else. So a much more stable thing than science. Now, science should certainly be one of the voices, but it should be an advisory voice, not a ruling voice, because government requires a more stable foundation. And in the last 30 years, our society has embraced the extreme consequences of a Freudian worldview, an interpretation that has now been accepted legally, based ultimately on a word game. The word orientation means direction or directionality. Sexual orientation is the directionality of a person's sexual desires, and their social desires too. It's not just purely just sex, but it's also their social direction, their social life goes into. There's another neat little cartoon, says, have you been oriented yet? Directionality. Saying I engage in homosexual sex, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, etc., is semantically the same as saying I engage in such things because that is the direction of my sexual desires, or sexual and social desires. You could add that in there. Sexual orientation simply describes what one wants sexually and socially. It's not a cause, but a description. People don't engage in homosexual sex because their sexual orientation causes them to. Their sexual orientation simply describes the behavior, but a word game has been played. A lot of times when you pull in scientific terminology or scientific sounding terminology, because there's a lot of terminology out there that sounds scientific, but really it isn't. Once you do that, you've got now this fancy term for something, and it's real easy to play a game on yourself, and you don't even know you're doing it, but you look at that term that describes a situation as if it's the cause of that situation. And that's kind of a logical fallacy. Certainly not the first one. This is a chart that I got from a website that's trying to push the new view of gender and sexuality. And their little meme is breaking the binary. The diversity of human sexuality and sexual orientation. Now, you'll notice that these four categories, splitting the human condition on sex and gender into these four categories, is a bit arbitrary. If you notice those two pointed lines below each of them, well, that's a symbol for a continuum. And what the new academics is trying to tell us is that, well, gender and sex and orientation are really part of a really an infinite line. Well, maybe it's not infinite, but it goes between the male and the female. But you would have infinite points along that line, rather than, what is really patently obvious. But gender identity, gender expression, biological sex is a big part of that. And then sexual orientation, these are all kind of artificial distinctions. The very concept of sexual orientation wasn't really invented until somewhere around the middle of the 20th century. Probably later in the 20th century, late middle. The whole idea of gender identity, well, that's even newer still. Gender expression. In other words, these are pretty much arbitrary and in many ways unprovable. Other than, biological sex, that's kind of obvious, okay? Binary means male and female, as in God created them male and female. One must break an idea that fits objective reality in order to substitute one that does not. This continuum of sexual identities, really an endless continuum. And this, of course, leads to the conclusion and the meme that is very popular today, that is, nothing's natural. Really? Male and female isn't natural, okay? The other things are just as natural. Nothing's really natural. Yeah. But lesbian author and commentator Camille Paglia reveals the truth, ironically, without necessarily meaning to either. She wrote in Vamps and Tramps, book came out a while ago, she said, nature exists whether academics like it or not. And in nature, procreation is the single relentless rule. That is the norm. Our sexual bodies were designed for reproduction. No one is born gay. The idea is ridiculous. Homosexuality is an adaptation, not an inborn trait. And the same could be said of all the other orientations that are popping up. But notice how Paglia concludes her line of reasoning here. She writes, we have not only the right, but the obligation to defy nature's tyranny. Page 70 and 71. Now I ask, does that sound familiar? Romans 1:26b to 27. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. And that's really kind of a cause and effect sort of thing. But notice natural relations. Notice what Ms. Paglia said is natural. So I'm sorry, now everybody's going to go with the meme that nothing is natural. It should be clear by now that this is not building logically, even on its own foundation. It's like they're making it up as they go along, and indeed, they are. And we need to ask where this has become the dominant culture now, and it really has. I mean, once something has totally absorbed virtually all of the education machinery, it's the dominant culture, and has been for 3 generations. So we would need to ask, what would we need to do to win the culture wars by reversing the bad legal decisions of the last 50 years without creating a perpetual, unwinnable, and it would be very much that, civil war? What would we have to do? Well, we would need to face the kind of thing below. The only good Christian is a dead right-wing Christian. The only good Christian is a Christian who embraces the atheist virtues and values through far left wing, and he's got socialist trade union membership. But really, you could fill in anything down there. You could fill in a far left view of sexuality. You could fill in a far left view of education. Really, anything you could fit down. The only good Christian, dead Christian. Yeah, and everybody is really focused on that. And you know what? You got to take it seriously, because these people are not, they're playing hardball. They are. And if they're not, they very soon will be. And people say, well, it could never happen in America, indefinitely detained in FEMA, these camps that are very similar to the internment camps of Japanese Americans in World War II. A lot of Christians that I talk to are really afraid of this, and not without some good reason. To wipe out the power, however, of those who many fear will indefinitely detain conservative Christians, and they might, but to wipe out their power, we would need to do the same thing to the progressives. Get them up, line them up in detainment camps, and of course you won't be able to detain, you can't detain an idea. All you can do is maybe wipe out all of the people, slaughter all of the people who have that idea. That is what they will try to do to us, left unchecked. And if we were left unchecked, what we would have to do to set things back to what we think was normal, which really wasn't. I think we've seen that the good old days were not really that great, okay? They had some advantages. Certainly there was the advantage of the possibility of an open biblical Christianity. Of course, all of the, did we take advantage of that as much as we should have? No. But we would have to do the same thing. We would have to take the same, deal with the devil kind of approach. We would need to use the very satanic ends justify the means methods of both the Marxist and the Nietzschean variety, out of fear that it will be used on us. And if we did that, not that really there's much chance of us doing it, but weird things can happen. I can't imagine how it would happen, but were we placed into that area where there was a temptation for it to happen that was realistic, and we did that direction, we would make the radical left into prophets. But there is a much more immediate danger, evil, that's coming at us as the pendulum swings back at us from that opposite extreme. Now, this danger is going to come in many forms, but it's all going to boil down to a generation of Christians, or increasing generations of Christians, entering the church without understanding that they must learn to question their own worldviews, both biblically and logically. All worldviews have things that need to go and other things that can be used redemptively and contribute. All worldviews. We saw the Greek worldview in the 2nd century. It had all of these problems with the incarnation, the resurrection, because of how it saw matter. And those things corrupted the faith, or tried to. But what did God do? He used another aspect of the Greek worldview, Greek logic, and its application by Aristotle and Aristotle's dictum, which we covered in the first week. The benefit of the doubt must go to a document that claims to tell a history and not abrogated to the critic. So, society also has been dumbed down, and of course, the inevitable consequence of that is people coming into the churches are now also dumbed down. And so we have to focus not just on biblical literacy, but general literacy. So that's kind of different, or at least it hasn't been that way really at all since like the 1500s. But unfortunately, too many pastors are catering to this situation rather than seeking to counter it. Fewer young pastors teach expositionally, and that's kind of dangerous. Presenting the gospel in a more winsome way has degenerated into making the gospel more winsome in the sense of making it more seeker-friendly to the prevailing culture. That presenting something is not the same as changing that something into something different. And that's what's kind of starting to happen here. And this has become a real big worldview blind spot for really most of today's churches, sometimes even ones who are sensitive to it. Now, the reverse historical pendulum swing is coming as a generation of new leaders become more and more postmodernists, not in their formal philosophy, but in their underestimation of Scripture as both objective and transcendent truth. People don't really think in these terms anymore. And we have to keep these terms relevant and knowable. Transcendent means something that comes from beyond the human realm, from God. Biblical ethics are a primary example of transcendent truth and authority higher than human law and culture. For example, the idea of inalienable rights we've shown through the past weeks comes from the transcendent truth that God has a law that is higher than human law, to which no legitimate human law can countermand. Those who enter the church under the assumptions of the coming pendulum backswing that I think is already heading our way will not even realize how much their own worldview has been shaped by fundamentally anti-Christian and anti-intellectual ideas, unless they are taught. In fact, some of them are coming from a totally different direction than what we would expect. We have already seen many of the far-reaching consequences of our civilization's denial of objective truth in the realm of human nature. To deny transcendent truth, observable biological gender, and moral absolutes, one must deny objective truth as it applies to human nature, but it never stops there. Rejecting objective truth has wide-ranging unforeseen consequences. We've gone over many of them. We saw that it leads to weakening the idea of common ground where people disagree. It leads to the cancel culture. Also, if there's no objective truth out there, there's far less motive to discover things. We saw that earlier. But it goes much farther even than that. Logic itself is now under attack from politicized academics. How weird is that? No, that's what we're dealing with. History as history dies. Making the denial of foundations the only undeniable foundation is an obvious logical fallacy. The very ability to know epistemology is breaking down in academics and now in everyday life. We got the postmodern thinking. Postmoderns supposedly have no worldview, but they do. The view that there is no correct worldview. And we saw how that's itself a foundational worldview. Truth is found in the community, not in the individual. So you have that little tribal thing going there. Postmodernism rejects ontological truth. Ontological truth, that's just a fancy term for truth based on the nature of something. You see an observed nature, and you see that certain things are true about that nature and other things are not true. So that's ontological truth. And meta-narratives. A meta-narrative is a broad narrative that brings meaning to lives and civilizations and religions, whatever. For example, the Bible would be our meta-narrative. But in other words, these rejections means that postmodernism accepts relativism. Now, the goal of postmodern scholarship, we saw, is to deconstruct beliefs such as Christianity, find out where it came from, destroy the violent meta-narrative, because the Bible is just so violent. Sometimes it is. Well, sometimes the real life is. The Bible is about real life. And the idea is to make it all meaningless. And the distinction between truth and fiction nearly vanishes. We are now 3 generations past the denial of objective truth, well into what I have called epistemological breakdown. It's just a little technical term I use, not because I want to sound more scholarly, but because it's actually shorter to say that than to say the breakdown of how we know what we think we know and what we really know. It's a little easier to just we already know that epistemology is how knowledge works and how we study knowledge and everything. So we're just going to go with that. If we were to reduce this situation from the civilization to the individual scale, well, that individual would be insane. He would be pathological. Now, this worldview is taught K through college by an education system committed to a logical fallacy, a symptom that even knows it's a logical fallacy. If coherent logic reveals fallacy, then toss out the rules of coherent logic. Effectively, that's what's happening in our colleges. Is people aren't being taught how to think, but ultimately now what to think. And the big problem with this for everybody is reality always catches up. Now, I've already experienced what I mean by the dangers of epistemological breakdown on a kind of a small scale, but it's going to be kind of this way as the worldview pendulum hits us from the opposite direction we expect. And I'll give you an example. I served on the board for really an excellent creationist ministry a few years back. And this isn't a reflection on creationism, okay? I am a creationist. Now, we had very stringent biblical requirements for ourselves and for those who we allowed to speak as guest speakers. I observed a couple decades ago that many creationist ministries are very well tooled for resisting attacks on the faith that come from the modernist evolutionary left. And they are, but not so much from the opposite end of the threat spectrum, an unwittingly postmodernist, literalist right. In fact, we really, a lot of us can't even think that that's even going to be a problem. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Because we had another board member, and seemingly solid creationist, spoke at the meetings many times. Suddenly, though, he shows this huge lack of understanding of how language works and a denial of objective reality, a reality the Bible teaches but using different words. The Bible doesn't use the word Trinity either, but it's one of the basic Bible doctrines. Well, so is the fact that God created an objective reality, that there's a difference between God and his creation, and that his creation is objective. You know, it's really out there. It's not just an extension of his mind. He didn't realize he was denying that, but he was. Because based on a faulty grasp of the literal versus the figurative use of language in Scripture, he began to claim that the Bible taught that the earth was literally flat. No, really. We actually had to deal with this as a group. I mean, it's like evolutionists accuse creationists of being flat earthers, and here there actually was one. And he came from the opposite direction. Now, though the political and the social left will continue to destroy our country unless something really radically changes, I can't imagine what, that the left in the political and the social will continue to destroy our country. It will likely be a tribal, semi-postmodernist version of the Christian right that will self-destruct conservative American churches if nothing changes in the years ahead. And we don't have many years for it to change. What should we look for as signs of this? Well, given the one I just gave, more crazy, oversimplified, and distorted versions of conservative Christianity, which will come at us in many forms over many issues. Anything can be distorted, people. The flat earth Christian movement was growing at the time I encountered it. I did a little research on it. This was a few years ago, but it probably still is growing. what I discovered was shocking. A good number of the people who are buying into this were college educated. Another sign, as all of this gets worse, is the temptation for increasingly alienated, or people who think they're increasingly alienated, but probably somewhat anyway, white conservative Christians are going to feel increasingly alienated. And the temptation is going to be to ally with real white supremacists who have long ago falsely co-opted our biblical terms. One of the biggest, most influential white supremacist group is called the Christian Identity Movement. They have co-opted biblical terms. You wonder why everybody associates the two? Well, that's why. That's one of the reasons. Now, as time goes on, this is going to seem more believable because of how the left has falsely redefined racism and the nature of white supremacy. It's been redefined, okay? Know the warning. I got this off of one of these woke websites. Know the warning signs of white supremacy. 1, full-time employment. 2, literacy. 3, professional and technical degree. 4, regular church or temple attendance. 5, auto insurance. 6, good credit rating. 7, no criminal record. Really, is that a sign of white supremacy? Or is that just a sign of people, thinking sensibly and keeping out of trouble? No. Now, from another site, I pulled this, and this is part of a chart on the aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the United States. And we're going to see some of this is true, but we're also going to see that some of it's a little off. Rugged individualism. The individual is the primary unit. These are a list of the assumptions. Self-reliance. Independence and autonomy are highly valued and rewarded. But that doesn't necessarily lead to the third point, which is that individuals are assumed to be in control of their own environment, thus you get what you deserve. Now, individuals obviously do have some control over their environment. Some have more than others for various different reasons. But it doesn't logically follow that you get what you deserve, as if you're completely in control of your environment. Because I don't care how hard you work or how self-reliant you are, you cannot control your own environment completely. You can maybe get limited control. Now, another emphasis of white culture, according to this woke website, is the emphasis on the scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, quantitative emphasis, and in the Protestant work ethic. Hard work is the key to success. Work before play. Well, that's just common sense. And this isn't unique to white people. Asians come over here and do that. Black people come over from Africa and do that. This isn't all invented by white people, and you're going to see that it isn't. But the Protestant work ethic, hard work, is the key to success. Now, again, though, we have another point that doesn't necessarily follow. If you didn't meet your goals, you didn't work hard enough. Well, that might be true. Just like it might be true that you have some control over your environment, and some people maybe have more than others. But it doesn't necessarily follow logically. And remember how when we talked about Nietzsche, we warned about how Nietzsche appeals to the right? To the degree that conservative white people accept those lower assumed that they're in control of their environment, and if you didn't work hard enough, you didn't meet your goal, it's because of that. Well, that's Nietzschean thinking. They're sort of like Nietzschean Job's comforters. And this is all leading to a civil war that in many ways will be very different from anything Americans have ever seen. Here's a book by Eric Mason called Woke Church. And I don't recommend becoming a woke church in the way it's defined, in the way wokeism is defined as a postmodernist construct. But the subtitle is not wrong. It says, an urgent call for Christians in America to confront racism and injustice. Well, those are things that Christians should have been confronting all the time, and some did, enough that a lot of progress was made. But Bible-based Christians need to think of better than just being on the right side when this civil war opens up. And we should think more clearly about it now before it does. In this country, we have always been able to serve Christ as prophets and our country as patriots in our 250-year history. But for the first time, we will now need to choose between being a prophet or a patriot. And that will head us in surprising directions at the very least. And the only hope I can see for the American church to survive as a viable, believable institution is if the black church and the white church come together as a truly biblical church. And it doesn't mean that all of the white church or all of the black church has to do this. No, really. Only the most biblical elements. And that hasn't been the case. Often the most biblical elements are the ones that are left behind. They don't take the leadership. Well, if we don't, who's going to lead? It's going to be the woke yahoos. And again, this doesn't mean wokeism or Jeremiah Wright. There are many black Christian leaders who are doctrinally sound. And we need to be reaching out to these people. Or if you're black and you're listening to this, reach out to us white folks. We're not all bad. If biblical conservative Christians do not begin to prioritize this more than they have, then the false woke postmodernist redefinition of racism to mean rejection of Marxism will stand. Now, how will Christians need to choose between being prophets and patriots? Why not both anymore? Well, back in the 1970s, Francis Schaeffer warned that tyranny can come from either the right or the left. Since that time, and up until pretty recently, it's been pretty clear that a lot of tyranny is coming from the left. But it can even come from both directions at the same time, but in different ways. We clearly cannot buy into the left's version of patriotism, which can be typified by this young lady, a real young lady who really did this. She complained that conservatives are intolerant of different opinions. And then she started pelting another student with rocks because he was wearing a MAGA hat, and demanded that he get off her campus. Well, she's trying to be an Antifa patriot. We can't accept that. We can't accept the left's version. But the right's version is quickly decaying into a cartooned distortion of what conservatism, even Christian conservatism, should produce. More of the right is now also denying objective truth. Why? We're 3 generations in to being universally educated or miseducated to this. It was only a matter of time before those on the right would also start down this path, and probably with less awareness of it than you'll find on the left. At least they know, the leaders, the movers, and the shakers will admit that it's irrational. Hold the line, patriots. God wins. Well, the January 6th patriots warned us of the barbarians at the gates in a staggering lack of self-awareness. I mean, that's really, to come in there like that, warning against the barbarians at the gates, man, that is staggering lack of self-awareness. Expect more of the same and worse. Are we as Americans still the people that John Adams spoke of when he said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other"? Are we still that people? Oh, we love Adams, but we overlook how this quote is a two-edged sword. A moral and religious people is a people who revere transcendent truth, like that which leads to the idea of inalienable rights. A people capable of being moved culturally toward a view of humanity as being made in God's image, moved even from such a radical hypocrisy as what existed when slavery ruled, when the founders lived. But they had a powerful set of truths that would unfold as people attempted to follow them. The people aren't really attempting to follow them anymore. Instead, they're pointing back at them and complaining about, well, what a bunch of racists they were. Well, many of them were, and even some that weren't, by today's standards, probably would be, because even though what they did was adequate for their times, it certainly would not be adequate for our times. So that's not a reasonable way to go about it. Are Americans still the people that Adam spoke of? And the issue isn't whether, we'd still go along with slavery or any of that. Can we Americans be moved today? As bad as it was in colonial times, there was a biblical Christianity that enabled people to be moved, saw that there was a discrepancy, and started moving them in the right directions. Yes, it took way too long, of course, but that's history too. History shows that America has made unprecedented progress toward the ideal of racial equality, though far from perfect, complete, or even unified. But reality catches up for everyone. And while Christians with biblical ethics made the foundation for social justice, Christian ideals led to the abolition of slavery, to the getting rid eventually of Jim Crow. But many Christian people and churches failed to live out those ideas or even actively worked against them. There's a difference between what the Bible teaches and what people who claim to believe the Bible and churches that maybe have a half-baked idea do. There's a difference. And this created a deep rift between the white and black churches in America. It was the white churches that excluded the blacks, rejecting James 1 through 9. If you show partiality, read James 2, 1 through 9. We don't have time to read it right now. But just consider, in the 19th century, even those who welcomed blacks into the church made them sit at the back of the bus. They had a special black section and a white section. And during Jim Crow, white Christians wouldn't let blacks into their church, or if they did, they had to sit at the back of the church, being the bus. In fact, the church was there before the buses were. James 2, 1 through 9. Reality catches up for conservative Christians too. And much of the current nightmare that we're living in right now can be attributed to our cumulative historical defections from biblical truth on humanity and race. That's one of the great wounds of today. Still is. Despite the slow ongoing penetration of biblical truth that has been behind, at least indirectly, the improvements on race and justice, of course, many of the white churches made their deal with the devil in order to maintain the status quo of slavery and then Jim Crow. That's why it wasn't a smooth transition in America like it was in Britain. And this, of course, led to another deal with the devil, this time by frustrated blacks. And they had every reason to be frustrated. Okay? Let's be honest. In accepting leftist ideology and methods that were rife with institutional racism. And by that, I don't mean the police. I'm talking about Planned Parenthood, lining up with the people who are lined up with that. We saw last week that Planned Parenthood was founded by a lady named Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenicist and a racist. She wanted to breed the lower forms of human life, lower what she thinks, out of existence. And so she focused her attention on making abortion legal. And even today, 90% or so of your Planned Parenthood clinics are in black neighborhoods. Now tell me that isn't institutional racism on a high order. The blacks have made a deal, many blacks have made a deal with the devil there, just like the whites made their deals with the devil that really created this situation to begin with. And of course, with groups, usually Marxists, that are pushing the destruction of the black nuclear family. That's what the slave owners used to do, people. Try to destroy the family, sell off the husband, sell off the wife once the kids were old enough. No family. And now you've got people who thinks black people or anybody should do that to themselves. Seriously? However, I don't think we can any longer make the case that there isn't at least some of what's called institutional racism. By the way, that's not just a woke thing, okay? That's not just a critical race theory thing. They've hijacked it. But really, originally, all it meant was that our society had, indulged slavery and then Jim Crow for a very long time. It would be very weird if there weren't some language, cultural leftovers from that time period. Maybe they're not as obvious as they used to be, but I'm sure they're still there. And certainly we can see that it was still there because here's the thing, the murder of George Floyd, you can't say that was an isolated incident. And here's why. Here you have Derek Chauvin kneeling on the guy's neck while dozens of people are filming him with their cell phones. The only way that these officers would have done that or could have felt safe in doing that is if they believed wholeheartedly that the system would back them up. And in order for them to believe that, the system, at least local to their area, but it's probably not completely local. It's probably not as widespread as woke people would have us believe, but you can't say it's not there because he had confidence. And that couldn't just speak of Minneapolis. So we can't really say that anymore, even though probably most police shoots, the vast majority of them, white or black, are valid shoots. You know, their lives are in threat or being threatened, or somebody else's life is being threatened, or sometimes regrettable mistakes happen. But the case for institutional racism in policing was at least strengthened by the fact that the murder of George Floyd was public and filmed by these cell phones. And in order for Chauvin and company to feel safe, well, they had to be confident that the system would back them up. If white and black Christians in America fail to recognize these demonic deals coming to both sides, then further worse deals with the devil will come from both sides in the years ahead, and probably not long off at all. They're already brewing. Most white conservative Christians today detest white supremacism. The false attempt by the left to automatically associate the two for political purposes is also a real factor. It throws a big distorting factor into the mix. But so is real history and the current temptation, which is going to grow as society decays. White nationalism and supremacy, while even now are relatively weak, they've been around long enough to really hone down their ideology. I was on what was otherwise a good conservative, often even conservative Christian website. I'm not going to name it because I don't think what I'm going to describe was there on purpose. There was an article, looked like a reasonable, conservative-oriented article, read through the article, and there were little highlights. And you clicked on those highlights, and they led to another article. But if you clicked on those highlights, you ended up on a white supremacist website. For real. It is for real. White nationalism and supremacy is tribal postmodernism just as much as the cultural Marxism that has been embraced by the Black Lives Matter organization. Just as much. In fact, it's much worse. It is the white counterpart of black nationalist groups like Nation of Islam, and much worse because it co-opts the terms of Christianity and brings life to the lie that conservative white Christians are mere tools of white supremacy. That's not true. But as I said, many of the major white supremacist movements, Christian identity is the biggest one. They have co-opted the terms of biblical Christianity, Phineas priesthood, whatever. What is unthinkable now will not be unthinkable in 10 or 20 years or even sooner, the way things are shaping up. Those of us I've been in the faith for over 40 years. The situation that we live in right now was unthinkable at the time when I first became a Christian. It's not unthinkable anymore, and the time is crunching down. So don't think this is unthinkable. It's not. And another aspect of epistemological breakdown is the lack of trustworthiness in the mainstream media. We all know about that. But I like this one here. Breaking news. Something irrelevant to your life just happened, and now we're going to blow it out of proportion and spend days to weeks keeping you distracted from what's really going on. You know. But as time goes on and conservatives balkanize, just like everybody else, we turn inward to our own little balkanized group, we are going to find our own news sources less and less reliable. Expect it. The distinction between hard news and editorial opinion, long blurred by the leftist mainstream media, is now getting increasingly blurred on the right. And this blurring is reinforced by the postmodernist denial of objective truth. 3 generations in, everybody's been educated in it. It means that Christians will have to get used to existing with far less actionable information than even in the recent past. At a time when reams of information is available on any topic, the very tools we need to tell which information is true or false, or useful and useless, are being dismantled. If we're dismantling logic in the universities, we're also dismantling all the other tools. This too is epistemological breakdown. The dismantling of the ability to know. Rome got an extra 125 years in the West and 1,000 years in the East from Christian influence. Our civilization is now looking at the gospel in an extremely skeptical, been there, done that sort of way. An idolatrous, dead, and self-satisfied church. By the way, idolatrous, Thyatira, dead, Sardis, self-satisfied, Laodicea. Those kind of churches cannot be whole, and they cannot represent the gospel effectively. Now, our earthly hope here lies in Philadelphia, and I don't mean in Pennsylvania. In case you don't know, that's what Philadelphia looks like on the surface right there. Our hope for continuing the faith for new generations lies in effectively healing American churches from this gaping and unbiblical wound it has carried since colonial times. If we don't focus on and think about it that way, we're going to lose. We're going to lose. Now, I don't know the name of this gentleman, but I certainly would love to meet him. He is a pretty well-known black church leader, though. And he says, I won't lay down my Bible for the mob. It's going to take genuine biblical faith from both churches. It doesn't have to be all of both churches, but it does need to be the most Bible-focused part of both of those churches. Of course, our ultimate hope is in the return of Christ. But even this hope can be misapplied. You know, there's a lot of kids out there who, they don't feel like, they're raising families now, and they don't feel like there's really any hope for the present. But they have to have some in order to raise their kids, you know. That would be the result of a misapplication of, the return of Christ. Our hope is not of this world. It never was, despite its benefits to those who trust in Christ in the now. And like I've said many times, I hope Christ comes before we finish the series here. But what if he doesn't? Prophecy from Christ himself warned us to occupy till I come. 2nd century Christians, 14th century Christians, those of the Reformation era and of others, all thought for powerful reasons that Christ would come in their day. But they had the expectation, yet they also prepared for this life. In the 1500s, we saw British pastors, English pastors, aggressively educating their congregations into the new forms of language made necessary by Bible translation. Can you think of that happening today? Something like it should. Even though the time of the beginning of sorrows be upon us, the beginning of sorrows has been on us since the late 1st century, given the times the church would live in back then. But the end is not yet. All this is not to say that our generation does not make the best case so far for the return of Christ being in our generation due to the detailed prophecies. And, check out those scriptures. You'll find them startling. But we must also show to our age genuine healing. And that's why I've beaten some of this to death. Judgment begins in the house of the Lord, but so does modeling the gospel in the now by the church. We can't heal the world. That's beyond us. But we can work toward visible healing and substantial healing of the American church, of which we are a part, knowing our times and the history that reveals our most glaring wound and its sickness. To say that the God of the Bible is the God of reality is only believable if we live in relational love among ourselves and seek to restore wholeness in our own house. Without that, we face a fearsome judgment, if not by God, then by simple cause and effect, even if it's not the loss of individual salvation, which really isn't the subject here. Objective truth lets us step outside ourselves and listen, if we will only avail ourselves of its potential. And the black church basically deals with the Bible a little bit differently. They live by examples from the history of a biblical cry for liberty. They've had to live that out. And so they generally will take stories from the Old Testament. It began with the freeing of the Israelite slaves and coming to the Promised Land. But since then, they will take other Old Testament and New Testament, and they will hone in on the narrative sections of Scripture and then use those things as exemplars. That's not wrong. That's a very valid. That tends to be the way they approach things. The white church is a little different. In the white church, you have a logical theology built on Scripture, and this is the root of true liberty. And it's been passed on from another man who existed at the end, the last generation of his civilization, very much like we are feeling is true today and probably is true today. And the white church inherited this logical theology from a black man. His name was Augustine of Hippo. And Hippo was in North Africa before the Arabs came over the northern parts of it. And North Africa was still peopled mostly by black people. That's one of the images of Augustine of Hippo. So this whole idea that biblical Christianity, conservative Christianity, yada, yada, is white man's religion, no. It got passed to us largely by a black guy. And more power to him. In America, these two churches need each other desperately if they're going to reach healing. In the final analysis, we're entering a time when a scripture that I confessed I've little understood until recently is seeming more and more understandable and relevant to me. That's Revelation 2, 10 and 11. And that would be, I think, Jesus, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. Let the evildoer still do evil, and the filthy still be filthy, and the righteous still do right, and the holy still be holy. I never could understand that whole let the evildoer still do evil. It's making more sense to me now. Because after a point, what else is there to do? And of course, this doesn't mean we don't live out and share the gospel, but it does mean that we are coming to a place where we're going to be living in a different dynamic than what we've been used to all of our lives. Especially we who live in a civilization that thinks it's been there and done that regarding the faith. Especially in a culture that has rationalized itself into imagining it can create its own truth. We can see that the spiritual warfare of our day and its effect on other realms is not as simple as just aligning with the right, or the left for that matter. Our pastor's wife, and for a long time, our senior pastor here, Pastor Robert Hall, recently passed away. The Lord took him home. And his wife, Juanita Hall, said something, one of the most wisest things that I've ever heard, especially in the study of history. And I think I've mentioned it in an earlier episode, but I'm going to end with it. Our worst blind spots hide in the shadow of our greatest strengths. Please take that seriously. Because I clearly don't have all the answers, and I know none of you do. But I hope this series has provided some godly insight that will help us to ask ourselves the right questions. In any event, thank you all for your kind attention. I know 30 weeks has been long, but I hope it's been fruitful. Bye-bye.